Welcome to DLS's Teacher Training Module on Student-Centered Learning. Let's get started. Let's look at the objectives of the module. By the end of the module, you will understand the differences between student-centered teaching and teacher-centered teaching, know how to engage your students to take more responsibility for their learning, use more interactive activities that help the student produce more language in the classroom. Now let's talk about student-centered learning versus teacher-centered learning. You may have heard the comparison of a sage on the stage versus a guide on the side. A sage is a wise person, and we can think of this person like a traditional professor, whose goal is to pass on information to students. He or she usually talks a lot and shares information through presentation, as you can see the teacher in the picture here in a more traditional classroom. This is considered a teacher-centered approach. On the other hand, a student-centered approach might be described as a guide on the side. The teacher is actively listening to the students and taking notes on their performance, but the focus of the class is not on her, it is on the students. Now let's look further into the differences between teacher and student-centered teaching. When we talk about teacher-centered and student-centered classrooms, it is not always black and white. Every teacher will use a little bit of both styles. However, in this list, we have separated out the typical characteristics of the two approaches. The focus is on the instructor in a teacher-centered classroom, where the teacher usually provides information to the students in lectures. Student-centered classrooms focus on the student, and the teacher uses guided discussions to introduce new concepts and information. Language rules are usually emphasized in teacher-centered classrooms, while student-centered ones focus on language use. In student-centered classrooms, students interact to produce language, and the instructor models the language. In teacher-centered classrooms, the instructor talks while students listen. Teacher-focused classes usually have learners working individually, while student-focused classes use more pair or group work in addition to individual work. In teacher-centered classrooms, instructors monitor and correct mistakes as they occur. They evaluate progress and answer all questions, while in student-centered classes, learners talk and the instructor provides feedback afterwards, often by having the student correct themselves, and students work with teachers to evaluate their progress. Instructor-focused classrooms are quieter, while student-focused ones are often noisy and busy. Now that you understand the differences between the two approaches, let's see why we prefer a student-centered approach for language training in our student population. Although there are many reasons to use a student-centered approach, we have identified 4 that are most important to us. First, a student-centered classroom keeps students involved and awake. Even in one-on-one settings, when the teacher does most of the talking, students lose focus and don't feel engaged. Second, making students the center of the lesson allows them to feel a greater sense of control. They can talk about the things that interest them and therefore feel more connected and motivated. Next, it maximizes language production or language use in the classroom. In most cases, the classroom is really the only place students have to practice using the language. It is essential that the student is doing most of the talking, not the teacher. Finally, a student-centered approach better prepares the students to use the language outside the classroom. In the real world, the student does not need to recite grammar rules or translate vocabulary, but will have to listen and respond in a natural way to many different inputs.